Good day. Today's February 24th, 2020. It's 62 degrees in here, but it's supposed to warm up today, and I think it's 62 outside too. And it's supposed to be warm, real warm all week, and even warming up. It's Monday. Stock market, last I checked, was 800 points down. Now, you understand the stock market is, or all the markets are more or less rigged, totally controlled these days. Most of the more realistic economists will say the same thing. They've been saying that for years, so have I. Salenti, up there in New York, upstate New York, says so. The oil market's probably the least controlled, but that's still greatly controlled. The housing market's controlled. All this ties in with what I'm talking about today: railroads, trusts, and trade. Stock markets represent trade, trading markets. Yeah, so anyway, it's down 800 plus points last I looked. Gold is up a little bit more. Gold market's been controlled ever since it was, well, even before, when it went up to $1,900. But it got pulled down and down around 11, 12 for a couple years. Anyway, railroads. I've always had a great interest in railroads from a little kid. I remember, I'm old enough. I remember for 9 years we lived close to the main line, the B&O line, and I recall seeing in real life a 4884, which is an articulated, huge, it's one of the biggest steam trains ever made. And I saw that going down the B&O line. One of my great uncles worked, I think it was for the B&O. My sister's got a picture of him with he was an engineer, and he had like 6 people working under him, his crew. He was a switch engineer, so he got to go home every night or day or whatever shift, because he just worked locally in the switch yard in Ohio. And he had one fireman, a conductor, 2 switch operators. They'd jump off the train and hand do the switches, because in those days they were hand operated, and 2 brakemen. This was back in the 1920s. The photograph we have, it's either a 280 or a 080 configuration. That gives the number of wheels that the train sits on, the engine sits on. Anyway, not that I learned a great deal from him. I just had a natural interest in railroads. I had a little model railroad, HO. I collected some of them, but they've all disappeared over the years, gotten stolen mostly. Anyway, railroads and railroad trusts. Because if you understand railroads, basically they run the world, or at least the civilized world, because what's called trusts. Now, a trust, the real short definition is when you take some property. Now, the dictionary, the Black's Law Dictionary, says a right of property, which is important. Of course, you have to look up the word right, and here's your 101 lesson in law. Uh, the legal definition is sometimes quite different than what the definition of a word is in Webster's. So if you're doing anything with law, you should always use either a Black's Law Dictionary, Bouvier's, or some other law dictionary. Now the word trust in Black's is like 5 different pages of what a trust is, and then there's a couple more pages of trust-related items in there. But it's basically a property of one party is represented or is overseen for the benefit of another party. And all these different words have similar meanings, but they greatly confuse the whole thing. In fact, a lawyer who specializes in trusts, that's all he'll deal with. And in fact, you'll have one lawyer dealing in a certain kind of trust, and some law firms deal only in trust law because it's so complicated. And so you'll have a whole corporation, a whole legal corporation that only deals in trusts, and that corporation may be in some big city, and it might be a multi-story building, all with lawyers and administrators and secretaries and researchers, and all working for trusts. But it's basically two parties with a whole bunch of middlemen in between. You'll have the truster, which is supposed to be the original owner, and the trustee is supposed to represent the property, supposed to represent it for a beneficiary. That's who's supposed to gain the rent or any means from that property. That's it in a nutshell. Now, a lot of hotshot lawyers out there will say, oh, he's not saying the definition right or something like that, but I'm just giving you the street. One property, an estate, a bundled property is like a bag of estates. It's like the stash is here, and it's supposed to be used for the benefit of this party over here. Now, getting back to the railroads, the reason the trusts are important is because basically all railroads were set up as trusts. Because starting in the 1820s or so, when railroads really started their beginning, they got with the governments to allow them to use right-of-ways, which would be the land where the railroad was going to be laid, where it was going to be built. Prior to that, an individual or a company would have to get together and go out and buy all, strips of land in order to build the railroad on. But not only the expense, it just got impossible, that you couldn't expect the railroad to go out and buy all this land. And plus, most of the land wasn't held by anybody because the Indians didn't claim land. They said they hire, the creator's land, and they just utilized it. So the people over in Great Britain, the British Empire, the corporation, which was the East India Corporation, City of London today, basically just laid claim to that land. So it was set up as a trust. so the railroad could go ahead and build. Now, the railroad. That's confusing too, because you've got the person who organizes a railroad, or the people who organize it, and sometimes that's the people who operate the railroad, and then you've got people who own all the rails, the ties, the railroad cars, the engine, all the property, and that can be another entity. And then you've got the party that builds the railroad and all the subcontractors under that builder. So you've got a lot of different parties that are assumed by many people to be the railroad. Now, throughout the 1800s, it turned out that usually the company or the corporation that built the railroad ended up owning the railroad by default, meaning that the people who were building it, the people who were organizing it and supposedly owned it, would go bankrupt. They'd run out of money, and they couldn't pay the people who were building the railroad, so the people who were building the railroad ended up owning that through the bankruptcy. And to make things further confusing, most railroads are leased today. In fact, I think all the railroads west of the Mississippi were set up as leases. So that gets even confusing. And if you really try to study all this, it begins to dawn on you that it's so confusing because the people who really ultimately own or control the railroad, control the trusts, don't want to be known. So their name is confused. And back in 1912, you had the Pujo Committee, it's P-U-J-O, I may not be pronouncing that correctly, was set up to find out who owned what, and where this went. And they studied it for a couple years and spent a lot of money, government money, trying to prove who owned what. And they finally threw up their hands because it was too complicated. They couldn't follow the money. They couldn't follow where the paperwork on who claimed and who operated the stash. And then that committee report was used as an excuse. Now, some of you have heard of the antitrust acts that were set up clear back in the late 1800s right through the 1930s. And these were antitrust acts, but usually if you read them, they were set up actually as because the lawyers and the people that really wrote these things and were working for the big corporations that the government and the people were trying to, or at least some of the government, was trying to bust up. Like we've all heard of the oil monopolies. They were supposed to be all broken up, but if you follow the paper trail, if you can, ultimately the same people, the same few families in the world still control the oil companies. Well, it's the same with the railroads. Now these trusts, the important thing, very, very most important thing, is these trusts were used as collateral, as stocks, to go into other businesses, including banking. The big banks all originated from the railroad trusts. So you understand, the same people who control the railroads control the banks. Same people who control the banks control the whole, basically all the corporations in the world, so they control and run the world. And the Peugeot Committee in 1912, 1913 was used to pass, as an excuse, to pass the Federal Reserve Act. Yeah. So it was actually pro-Federal Reserve Act. And in some of my other videos I go into that, and some of you understand how the Federal Reserve controls everything. And it's basically an insurance, kind of like an insurance company, insurance corporation. And it's important that you understand that the insurance companies, there's really no difference between the banks and the insurance companies, but they control and operate the world because people over the decades, over the centuries, have not wanted to be responsible. They say, oh, if I have an accident, I don't want to pay you. I want this other person to pay you for the damages I caused you. So these insurance companies, corporations came about, and you paid some money into the insurance company every year, every month, so that they would pay off your problem if you did something. Because today people don't want to be responsible. In fact, that's what government is. They, under the Constitution, the people were supposed to run the government. But since the Civil War, corporations have run the government, because the corporations are basically service corporations, and they service the people because the people don't want to form their own government. So you have these corporate governments, municipalities, which are basically just trusts again. So they're all municipal corporations. They're not government by the people and for the people. And when you have a representative, when you sign up for a representative, that representative is free to do whatever they want to, and they represent the corporation. They don't represent you anymore. Getting back to the railroads, this trust. The railroad was for the benefit of the people. And we've got the railroads basically to thank for civilization today, because they brought wealth to wherever they went. And of course you've seen or heard the Indians, the Native Americans, when they see the iron horse coming, they go, there goes the neighborhood, you know, because the choo-choo train brought white man from the east and all the problems and the claims, the trust properties. Now these trusts, getting back to this, the way they're written up is the railroad has a right-of-way. Now this right-of-way, depending on where it was, didn't just include the railroad bed. It included sometimes a mile on either side of the railroad, and sometimes great plots of land, you know, as far as you could see from the railroad, because the railroad trust had claim to like all the lumber, because the trains needed wood to burn and build the truss ties under the tracks, and they owned a lot of the movement of the cattle. They owned a trust, a share of everything that was hauled on that train. So they could set up companies to, like cattle slaughterhouses, to buy the cattle at the different places they went, and then ship it back to Chicago to be butchered, and and basically they controlled all this. The same with oil. And the big thing was communications, because in the 1870s, one railroad in particular was amended for their right-of-ways to put up telephone poles. I mean, Morse code, excuse me, to run the Morse code lines, which eventually became the telephone lines, which also included the electric lines. So the railroads were at the foundation of more of our civilization. They controlled the electricity through their trusts, through the communications. And the communications today has been extended to all communications, computers, search engines. So you understand how the the families who own all these large corporations are all extended from the railroad trusts back in the 1800s. And it boils down to maybe 7 enlarged families in the world that control all this. And one of them is the Payees family. It's a ancient old French family, Payesu or something like that. It's supposedly extends from the French royalty. Actually, at the Civil War, them and 5 or 6 of their buddies all bought the railroads of the South that was confiscated by the North, by the military. And the one family in particular, now this was an auction, I've explained it in my other videos, but basically it was a controlled auction. Only certain people could go there. And this one fellow, for $480 in gold, bought this one rail line. And this rail line basically had spurs that were larger than that one railroad line. And then a few of the other ones, his buddies, who he probably gave the money to, bought the other leases. So they basically ended up controlling all the railroads eventually, because the northern railroads were under the military martial law of the Civil War too, and really they've never really been let out. Now the people who run the railroads today are basically, it's a lease, so it's hard to pin down who owns what, but I tracked it down to one of the strongest railroads to have the direct paperwork is the Southern Railroad. I can't think of it right now. Anyway, it's in the southeast part of the country. But the important thing, that one railroad that the trust was amended where they owned the electric and communication lines was the Charleston, Cincinnati, and Chicago Railroad. It was called Triple C, and I remember as a kid seeing some of the boxcars that had the Triple C. It said triple, and then it had big C with a smaller C inside and a smaller C, and that was known as the Triple C. But it ran from the Carolinas through Ohio to Cincinnati. And like I say, it was amended. the contract was amended, the charter was amended so that they had control of the electric lines and the communication lines alongside the tracks. Now, it's something like 350 of the 500 corporations under the top 500 corporations in the country are controlled by this family, although this family, I don't know, 100 years ago or something, was schemed out of another family, got more control of these properties. So the Pacer family really, they may have the original titles, which are just trusts, to this property, but basically the mafia type, the modern mafias, operated under everything, and that's what the different foundations, the Bill Gates Foundation and the Clinton Foundation, these are all pay-to-play foundations. Just like in the mafia, you pay them in order to be allowed to do things without the law coming down onto you. It's how all the drug cartels are operated. The cartels that have paid the people up high, the elite, the money, hush money, they're allowed to continue their business, and those that haven't paid, those are the ones that are sicked on by the DEA agencies. And so the war on drugs is basically just a front to protect the big ones and to get rid of all the competition, the little guys that haven't paid to play. So you understand? So now these 350 odd corporations that are owned by just a few families, there's other corporations that are not on the top 500, smaller corporations that are also owned by them. So they control a big part of the world. So let's see, that's 27 minutes. That's almost a half an hour there. And I haven't really talked too much about the railroads, but I've talked about the trusts. And the trusts lead back to the Virginia Company, the Virginia Land Company, that was a British company that was set up in Virginia. And basically that's where the state of Virginia comes from, and all the state of states, the different states, which are corporations. They're not under the Constitution. They're corporations. And they come under the City of London, and the Pope, the Vatican, ultimately claims, overshadows, owns the City of London. So because they're representing you. The Pope represents all the Catholics. And it's all a trust, in a sense. You're putting your trust in the Vatican, in the Pope, representing God, so that you go through the Pope to speak to God, because God speaks to the Pope, supposedly. That's all the hide the stash, as I call it. The different names confused, so you don't know who's got the stash, who controls the stash, who's behind the New World Order. And it ain't, as Carlson said, it ain't you. The comedian. Yeah, okay, that's coming on to half an hour, and I wanted to keep this. But that's the great interest in the railroad. So for all you railroad buffs, you should really get what I'm talking to, because these are the important things about life and who controls everything. So, good day, and keep plugging away. More power to you.